Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon from Cairo, Egypt. I am Samer Atallah, Associate Professor of Economics and Associate Dean for Graduate Studies and Research at the American University in Cairo School of Business. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I hope you are all well, safe, and healthy. It is an honor to welcome you today to a special webinar of the Willard W. Brown International Business Leadership webinar. The title of today's webinar is Rethinking Macroeconomics in the Digital Age, featuring a very distinguished speaker, Subir Lall, the Deputy Director, Middle East and Central Asia Department at the International Monetary Fund. Subir has an international experience spanning all over almost every corner of the world. He was the country representative, the IMF mission chief for Egypt, Portugal, Germany, the Netherlands, Indonesia, Korea, Malaysia. He has been also the co-author of the IMF World Economic Outlook, which is its latest edition, has been launched a few moments ago, and the Global Financial Stability Report. He has served also on the academic advisory panel of the World Economic Forum Financial Development Report. During the talk, if you have any questions, please write them in the Q&A box that you will find at the bottom of your Zoom page. Thank you all. We hope you all enjoyed today's webinar. Subir, the floor is yours.
Thank you for the kind introduction, Dr. Samer, and thank you also to you and to Dean Kamel for inviting me, and to Ms. Safa and Ms. Jalan for helping put this event together. It's a great pleasure to be back here at the AUC School of Business, even if this time it is only virtual. But perhaps given the topic of today's talk, it's quite appropriate that we are doing this in a virtual format, because this is in fact a product of the digital age. I hope the audience also join Dr. Samer in hoping that everybody is well and managing in these circumstances. So today I'd like to present some thoughts about how the digital age is affecting macroeconomics and also the future of work, and how younger people in particular need to think about the changes that are going on all over the world, and the changes that move literally at the speed of light. But what I want to present is a framework through which we can all think about the changes due to technology, and in fact there are other things as well which I will discuss. I believe this framework is a useful way for all of us to try to look at this. And I will also present an example and illustration for those of you who are interested in macroeconomics. And maybe this framework can answer one puzzle, which is about why inflation has been persistently low in many advanced economies. And I'm working with some colleagues here on other aspects of this work as well, taking it forward. Next slide, please. So, in terms of the outline of the presentation, I will keep this quite non-technical, given that we have a limited amount of time, but the presentation itself and the references will have some more technical details that you might find useful. So I'll first try to describe what the fourth industrial revolution really means. I'm sure you've heard of it, and it is talked about quite a bit, but what are the changes and what are we talking about specifically? This will be followed by a short discussion of why it is of interest to all of us to understand these changes and how best to take advantage of them. I will then offer the proposition that what is a critical feature of this fourth industrial revolution is actually something called intangible investment. And focusing in on that, I will use this to discuss briefly some of the work that my co-author Li Zeng at the IMF and I did on applying such a lens or a framework to the question of why inflation has been so low for so long in many advanced economies. Then we'll come back towards the end, towards the bigger picture of what the implications are of these changes that are going on. I will argue that we are just at the beginning of these changes, and these changes are going to permeate across more sectors and industries over time. And so the question is, what can the younger generation and employers and managers do to take full advantage of this phenomenon? Next slide, please. So Now, the fourth industrial revolution, industrial revolutions in general are defined as, when changes happen very fast and very widespread in how we produce things. So it's a very quick, very widespread, and changes the nature of production itself. Klaus Schwab was one of the people, he's the founder of the World Economic Forum, and he writes extensively about this phenomenon. And so the references are here, and I would encourage you to read some of his writings. But it is generally agreed that the first industrial revolution was the use of steam and water power. And that, for instance, gave us mechanized textile production. The second industrial revolution used electrical power and also telephones for communicating with each other. And, one example, and of course, the internal combustion engine. And the assembly line for cars is an example of the second industrial revolution. The third one was automation of production and the use of electronics and information technology. That started quite early. I mean, it started in the 60s. It's still ongoing. In fact, that's how most factories operate now. And the fourth industrial revolution is generally associated with the information revolution and the internet and the knowledge economy. And I will discuss many examples of this as we go through the presentation. Next slide, please. So let's take a slightly deeper dive. So what is so special about this fourth industrial revolution? Well, one, it is marked by connectivity between people instantaneously through communications technology. And as we are doing right now, as a matter of fact, but we can, and some of you might have logged on to this Zoom over your cell phones or your tablets. So that's possible now, but it's also communication connectivity between machines. This also means there's a huge amount of processing power. In fact, your mobile phone now has more computing power than the computer that was used to put men on the moon in Apollo 13. So just think about that. And there's also, of course, the use of artificial intelligence in many ways. You see that, if you're writing an email, for instance, and so you, in some software, it'll even suggest a reply for you to use. But at the same time, this is not just about technology. It is also about processes, business processes, and organizational models. Where once we were used to having large companies in a hierarchical structure, now one sees more decentralized business units, more creative centers, less structure. So that even the nature of how work is organized in firms is changing as well. I mean, it is, for instance, possible to work from home, something that was not possible, and that by nature becomes a decentralized process. And we will discuss another important phenomenon, that there are much more synergies across products and across sectors. And all these changes are happening at an exponential pace, and that's why it's called disruption. And so these are some of the ways to look at the fourth industrial revolution. Next slide, please. So the question we asked ourselves was, are these changes not just about new products, new things, but are they fundamentally changing the way we should think about economics, about growth, about inflation? And is this change, as it spreads to the corporate sector, and I'll try to make the case that we are just really at the beginning, is it also changing the structure and composition of the business sector? And of course, one thing we all need to care about and should is, what does this do in the long term to inequality, to labor markets? How does financing need to adapt to finance businesses? And perhaps most importantly, what is the future of work? How should we think about this if we want to, with all these changes, if we want to look ahead 2 or 3 decades, which is your career horizon, how do we put all of this into a structure that we can sort of try to make sense of? Next slide, please. So let me start with some examples to give you some ideas of fascinating changes. And I want to emphasize, this is not just about the technology sector, although technology has a big part of it. Now, airlines is one of the examples I found fascinating. Airlines, were a great way to lose money, and for 80 years, more or less. In fact, they said, then how do you become a millionaire in the airline business? Is you start as a billionaire, and then sooner or later you'll have lost quite a bit of money. But now they have become more efficient and consistently profitable. How did this happen? You can see it in, of course, aircraft engines became more efficient, materials became better, but also, very importantly, airlines invested in software and IT and things that make sure that every seat on every plane is full. And sometimes, the person sitting next to you on the plane will not have paid the same price as you did for your ticket. That, earlier it used to be common to go into airplanes and see them somewhat half empty or something. And, you'd find the seat next to you empty. You could pull up the armrest and stretch out. Now that's just not possible. The planes are usually more than 80% full when the average previously used to be between 60 and 65%. Automobiles were simple and mechanical, and now they're basically like mobile computers. In fact, now you need a computer to diagnose what's wrong with your car when you take it into the shop. Similarly, ride sharing, something that just didn't exist until recently, and it combines cars, drivers, phones, and the internet, things that were there, but everything came together. Then, of course, we all know about these bicycle exercise programs at home, the stationary bike and a computer. And then there's a trainer somewhere who's basically telling you that you need to pedal faster and that will make you very fit. Those are all outcomes of this. Similarly, there are gym training programs worldwide. Somebody develops a program somewhere, and then that is franchised all over the world. Everybody uses the same training program. And of course, we have home automation, where, is another example. So these are some examples of what concretely it has meant for us to have the fourth industrial revolution, which previous generations didn't. Next slide, please. So then, what is the common thread for intangible, for all these changes? We would argue the common thread in all these things is what is called intangible investment. When we think of investment, we normally think of what's called bricks and mortar kind of things, plants and equipment, a big factory and machines. But in fact, intangible investment is non-physical investment, but something that still matters for production. And some of it, in fact, is not even fully captured in GDP yet. Just to give a simple example, hardware is physical investment, but software is non-physical investment. So when you think about technology or IT, this distinction, as I will try to show, is actually quite important. Another example is branding and a brand identity, doing market research. In a way, it's knowledge. These are also intangible investments that change the nature of production. What students do is often acquire they're doing intangible investment and developing skills in human capital. Think also of training programs, managerial processes, some things that MBA students, business school learn. These are also non-physical, but of course contribute to more and better production. Databases, research and development, of course, is well-known example. Patterns, artistic, originals, entertainment, re-engineering. These are all examples of intangible investment. So the key is they're not physical, they're non-physical. And the defining work on this was done by Haskell and Westlake. It's references in the back. It's a book called Capitalism Without Capital. And I highly recommend you read it. This is really an enlightening book, and it's very, it's a pleasure to read that book. Next slide, please. So there are some distinguishing features that Haskell and Westlake point out about intangible capital. And these are special and usually not true of tangible capital. And one is scalability, which means it can be scaled for little additional cost, like software business processes. Once you have a software, creating multiple copies after the initial investment is easy for the maker of that software. It often has synergies as well, which means it interacts with different things to create different products. And the example I used about smartphones and ride-sharing software, they allow bigger networks than traditional taxis. So there are synergies between different things. Another interesting facet is sunkenness, which means they highly customize the software or the process, and they're not standardized, so you cannot sell them. Think of it as, an example we all know is like coffee shops. There are global chains of coffees, but what's special about them is they've perfected the logistics of making a good standardized cup of coffee everywhere. And that's not easily transferable to a different set because it's very custom built in a way for them. And sometimes it is because of that, it's also, very specialized. And then finally, there is the question of, it is, because it can be used more than one place at a time, it creates opportunities for spillovers. Using that intangible capital does not deplete its availability. So that's the non-rivalry that you see on the slide. And non-excludability means that you don't actually prevent others from using it. Sometimes you can, because if there are patents and licenses, but in general, the same people can use the same investment at the same time. Next slide, please. So now you might say, okay, this is great. I know intangible investment, very interesting, but is it really such a big thing? As you can see in this chart, in fact, it's hard to see, but I'll give you a few highlights. Intangible investment is actually rising. The blue line is intangible as a ratio of tangible investment, and the red is as a ratio of GDP. If you look at the US and the UK chart, the US is at the very bottom on the right-hand side, middle in the bottom row. Intangible is actually more than tangible investment already. And it's likely to increase over time in other countries as well. In the UK also it is more, although there was a strange pattern which we are still trying to understand of why it dropped so much. But you can see this is happening, and it's happening everywhere. These are the countries for which we have data right now. But of course, it's clear that this is happening, and especially because of its nature, it can travel over borders very quickly. Next slide, please. So let me tell you a little background how this project began that Lee and I worked on. It was really a tweet, funnily enough, and it was from Bill Gates. And it's a chart that he remembered from his Econ 10 class at Harvard. And he drew this chart and said, normally we think of, the basic economic model is supply and demand. And then he said, you know what, I think software doesn't really work like this. And the portion of the world's economy that doesn't fit this model just keeps getting larger. So, and that's not just about software, but there are other parts of the economy. So that got us thinking, supply and demand are at the foundation of economics, both in microeconomics to clear individual markets, and in macro, where we do aggregate supply and aggregate demand. And in fact, a lot of macroeconomic policy is something that I spend a lot of time working on and thinking about. It's about shifts in the demand curve and how to shift it back. But you know what? At the same time, the aggregate supply curve that we use mostly in our frameworks, and I'll come back to it for a brief second later, is something we haven't thought very much about for a long time. The aggregate supply curve that we normally use in our simple frameworks looks not very different from what Samuelson first put in his textbook in the early 1950s. We were all so focused on demand. Supply was like, well, this is how it is and life will go on. But in fact, that's not exactly how things work. Next slide, please. Without going into too much detail, in the theory of the firm, the supply curve is upward sloping. What we just saw in that little sketch was because of a rising marginal cost, which means that the more you want to produce, you have to pay more in wages, you have to pay more in the borrowing capital, and that's why your costs go up. So your price has to go up for you to break even. In traditional macro models, we aggregate that over the economy to say that the short-term aggregate supply curve also slopes upward. Now, the question we had is, what if your cost does not go up? I mean, we talked about scalability in intangible capital. And if intangible capital is scalable, and supposing I only used intangible capital, then I could expand without it costing me anything more. And so the more I use intangible capital, the easier it would be for me to scale up. So that means something might be happening with the supply curve and the shape of the supply curve. Next slide, please. So what Lee and I did was we looked at the economy's aggregate supply curve, and we got a very nice data set, which is cited here by Corrado and others. And we tried to see if indeed the aggregate supply curve is becoming flatter for countries. And in short, we found that there is in fact a robust relationship. The more intangible investment in an economy, the flatter the aggregate supply curve. Next slide, please. Now, this is just to show you the chart. You can see the old period and the new period. So the newer period is the blue. It's flatter than the old period for two countries. And we did that for a number of countries. I'll leave the details in terms of how we derived it. It's in the paper that we cite, but I just wanted to give you an illustration of that. Next slide, please. In fact, so we did it for a number of countries, and here you can see it's again not very clear on a screen, but it's in the paper. The flattening of this curve is in fact statistically significant in most countries. And so this is consistent with what what we thought, which is that there are actually two major drivers of flattening of the supply curve, which is globalization, because if you can source your inputs globally, then your costs are likely not limited by your domestic sources of supply of those things. And similarly, of course, intangible capital. So we find effects from both of those. It's not just intangible capital, but intangible capital is also a part of it. And it's not just globalization. Next slide, please. For those of you who are interested, again, this is just for completeness. A little stylized representation of the regression we did, but it's in the paper, so I think we can move on from this slide. And we, again, just for completeness, these are the results that show that we have found highly statistically significant results and coefficients. For most countries, the gray shaded ones are where the results didn't support our conclusions, but this is when we did the regressions for each economy. Next slide, please. When we did a cross-country regression, in fact, we found very strong results for all of them. And from a cross-country perspective, certainly it's true that higher integration with the global economy and larger shares of intangible capital are associated with a more flat aggregate supply curve for the economy as a whole, or a more elastic curve. Next slide, please. So now you might say, oh, great. You've shown that supply curves are flatter for many countries for which we have data, but so what? Why does it matter? Because, the macroeconomic equilibrium is the intersection of supply and demand curves. So the shape of the supply curve affects the impact on GDP, on inflation, and on employment. When an economy is hit by a shock, goes through a recession, that's why it matters. In a recession, output, employment, inflation all fall, but how much they fall and how quickly they bounce back, it all depends on the shape of the supply curve. Next slide, please. So what it means is that for the same shock, one may get a bigger loss of output and employment, but one would also get a bigger bounce back and recovery if, in fact, the economy is becoming more elastic. And one may see smaller fluctuations in wages and prices. So, if you're from the outside looking in, it might look like prices are becoming stickier. They just don't move that much. And that's, in fact, in advanced economies, one is seeing a bit of that. Now, in new Keynesian models, the assumption is that prices are sticky, but could it be, in fact, that they're not sticky? It's just that you need a smaller movement in prices now to clear the market because the economy is becoming more elastic. So what it would also mean is that monetary and fiscal policies continue to be effective in restoring output and employment, but they might have a bigger challenge bringing inflation back up to its target. Next slide, please. So this is a bit of a visual representation of what I just discussed, and I'll not go into that, but you can again, refer to the paper or for some of the details. But this is basically what it's saying. If you look on the right-hand side, if the slope of the AS curve is flatter, that obviously tells you that the equilibrium might end up, what you see is E double prime is the same full employment output, but at a lower level of prices than at E star, which was where we started. So you can get hit by shock, you move from E star to E prime, but then you might end up at E double prime, which is still full employment, but just at lower prices. So that was an illustration of this concept with intangible investment. Next slide, please. Now let's come back to the bigger picture, because I've tried to make the case that intangible capital is critical to understanding the fourth industrial revolution. And it is permeating, in fact, all sectors and all industries. Even traditional brick and mortar businesses are being transformed. I mentioned airlines. I also mentioned gyms. Those were, we didn't necessarily think of gyms, for example, as technology, but Haskell and Westlake make an excellent argument in their book that, this is what is really happening across more and more sectors and industries. So I would invite you to look around you and look at different sectors and industries and see if you can identify how, in fact, the use of intangible capital has either already changed that sector or has the potential to change that sector. Now, what that means is that in the future, the rewards to skills in the job market will be for those who can create intangible capital or can apply it creatively. And that's where the opportunities would be. Now, of course, on the other hand, if there's the intangible capital and like physical capital and machines in the past, if they can substitute for human skills, then those will eventually be replaced over time. When we saw that, right, when the automobile replaced horse-driven carts, that replaced both the drivers of the carts and the horses. But intangible has the same kind of effect that, some things can be removed from, but it'll create more opportunities as well. Ultimately, of course, what makes us human will remain human. And those are things like creativity, emotional intelligence, power of imagination, invention, experiences. Satya Nadella, who's the Microsoft boss, has written a very nice book called Hit Reset, which also I would encourage you to read when he talks about technology, but also talks about things that these changes will not be able to substitute for. And the question is how best to capitalize on these changes. I certainly believe that these will increase human potential and not limit it. Next slide, please. This is the final slide. And this is changing all sectors and industries. One of the things that is now becoming more widespread, for instance, is, bicycle sharing. And in fact, if I look out of my window, I have a bicycle stand there, which is connected with software. So I can just swipe my software, my card on my phone, and then use that bike. And, so it's going across sectors, and there's not something to be feared. In fact, it's a once in a lifetime opportunity. I mean, think about it this way. The distinction is important. Like doctors, we'll always need doctors, but in fact, the changes where they can have intangible capital help them look through thousands and thousands of, say, x-rays and things, and narrow it down to say, okay, this is likely to be the diagnosis. Ultimately, you'll still need a doctor to make the call. Similarly, in the legal profession, what paralegals used to do, now machine reading can read through thousands and hundreds of thousands of legal opinions and documents, but ultimately you will need a trained legal professional to be able to use that to make an argument. So it's a complementary and not a substitutional skill in that sense. One interesting thing is that once you have created that intellectual sort of that capital, the intangible capital, replicating it is less costly. And so in a way, individual ingenuity and imagination can help in the scaling up. And so it's available to all of us potentially. It can be tied to entrepreneurship. It can create new engines and drivers of growth. It can create job creation and living standards improve for all. And so those who can create value from this will stand to benefit. I mean, of course, in downtown Cairo, there's a Greek campus, and there are I've been there a number of times, and there are a lot of people doing very interesting entrepreneurial things. And this would be an example of what, applying that. And one doesn't, it's not like the old days where if one has an idea, one needs to set up a huge factory and have all these, in the 1930s and 40s, say in Western Europe and 20s, and you need big financiers in the US for that matter. This is much more accessible to everybody. And it's just a question of thinking of how to apply it to different sectors and how to improve the product and also how to take advantage of these changes. Finally, what this means is that the approach to learning has, going forward, to focus on developing skills for creative problem solving. It already does that, but that'll become more and more important. Connecting dots, innovation, thinking outside the box. Learning has evolved a lot. It used to be at one time focused on memorization, rote learning, studying for an exam. Now, eventually, especially as these changes permeate all sectors and industries, it'll be ingenuity and problem solving, and that will create opportunities for everybody and successes. And, as I said, this does not limit human potential. In fact, it expands the range. Let me stop here, and I'll be happy to take any questions. Dr. Semer, back to you as the chair. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. This is fascinating, to say the least. I cannot hide the fact that I was a bit scared of the future, but personally, I'm very happy that I'm not teaching courses next semester, because if I come back to the students with a flat supply curve, I think they would really call me a lunatic, to say the least. We have lots of questions. It's a very interesting discussion, and I mean, one thing, obviously, most of the attendees are from Egypt and the region, and the first question that comes to their mind is, does this apply to us? Are we going to see the same thing? We still, I mean, in Egypt and a lot of countries in the region, we are still living in a duality of an economy where there is a typical traditional sector that employs a lot, and a very small industrial sector, and a very large service sector. So does this apply to us? I mean, part of the services industry that we is critical to our economy is the real estate industry, the tourism industry, and so on. And what about the traditional industries that we have here, like textiles?
Okay, so maybe I can take that question now, or would you like to? I can go ahead with this.
I mean, I think this is a common question, so I think it's going to take you a bit of time to answer it, and then we'll go over the rest of the questions.
Sure, Dr. Semer. No, I mean, it's a very good question. So the paper, which you saw the citation, and I would encourage everybody to take a look at that. We look at where we had the data for it, and this was only for a limited number of countries, and mostly among the OECD countries. But what we do see in that is some countries are clearly further ahead than others, and so it's moving at an uneven pace. As I mentioned, in the US and the UK, it seems to be the most advanced, but others are catching up as well. It stands to reason that this will also be the case for all emerging market countries and developing countries at different pace at different times. I'm from India, and so I see that when I go back in some sectors, it is hugely prevalent. You can do things with your cell phones, your bank work, and you can do, your bank statements and payments and all those things, including buying from the street vendor. You can use your cell phone to pay, not use cash anymore. That's an example. But of course, the pace is different. So the short answer is yes, it will be a phenomenon everywhere. It is hard to conceive how any country would not be part of this change, especially because this, as I said, is intangible capital. It can move across borders at the push of a button, right? The technology, the adoption, an app. You don't have to be physically present to be able to use an app developed elsewhere, for example, or knowledge or training or a business process. These things, that's the beauty of intangible capital in a way. You don't have to put it on a ship and sail it over the ocean. You can have it overnight. So it will happen, but the pace will obviously vary. So, and I'll be honest, we don't have data yet enough for other countries to know at which stage other countries are, but it will happen, and it'll happen across sectors. You mentioned, for instance, two things: real estate, and then, of course, traditional industry. Now, textiles, for example. Now, what does that mean? I mean, some sectors now, as I mentioned, that even creativity is a way an intangible investment, art, and so the things within textile, there are very specific things that are created in Egypt and other countries, and those will of course remain because that's what makes them so unique. And it's not like if a machine produced that, I would enjoy it as much. No, because what I like is the creativity of the person who went into. It's like a piece of art. Real estate is different in a way, because what you have in, for instance, in real estate, let's think of home buying, especially now in the COVID times. You have a lot of virtual 3D tours of houses. You never need to step into the house. You go on your computer, take a tour of the house. You can have a 3D view of the house. And then you can buy a house essentially without ever having stepped into a bank or into the house itself, because everything you can do. So that will happen to more and more sectors. Maybe another example is, of course, cars, self-driving. Now, there's been a lot of hype around it, and, it's not nearly as advanced as some people thought it would be. We are not in the future where, you can just hop in and the car will take you wherever. But it's not inconceivable that at some point that might happen too, And again, it's a great example of scalability, because once you've developed that technology, scaling it up costs basically nothing to replicate it across the industry. So let me stop here. Maybe I hope that was clear.
Yeah, that's very clear. Thank you. I'm going to aggregate the questions into their field. So there is a handful of questions about education. So yes. There is one interesting question is, how are we going to teach macroeconomics moving forward? And the other question has to do with, how do you think us as business schools that are at the forefront of preparing future leaders should adopt to this new sets of skills that are required for the market, for the future of the job market, and so on and so forth. So, I think these are the questions related to the education. So I just tried to the best of my ability to add them together. So if you can address that, and then we move to other more technical questions in the next batch.
Okay, no, so absolutely. Macroeconomics going forward, yes. I mean, macroeconomics has gone through phases, right? We had the Keynesian revolution since the 30s, essentially, the Great Depression time. Then there was the neoclassical revolution, 60s and 70s, Friedman and others. And then the new Keynesian revolution. So it goes through these phases when the traditional models stop being able to explain what is happening in the real world. Economics is still a social science for most of us. Of course, I mean, especially when you're going through graduate school, as you know also, Dr. Subir, sometimes we get very caught up in our models and how elegant they are and the mathematics of it. And but the danger of that is sometimes, I think it was, who was it who said that? Somebody famous said that you end up mistaking beauty for truth because your model looks so beautiful. You think this is how the real world works. But no. And then sometimes the evidence keeps coming back and telling you, you know what? Your model is not the real world. Maybe you need a different model. So what my co-author Li Zeng and I are hoping is this will at least provoke some thinking that, folks, we've all been focusing on the demand side of the equation. Have you given some time to think that, all the changes that we are seeing around us, the moment we step out of the door or even on the Zoom, this might have an effect on supply, short-term aggregate supply, for example. There's been a lot of discussion on technology and what it does to long-term potential growth, for example. And, why is it not showing up in higher growth rates or productivity? We stay away from that. We focus really only on the short term. What we are trying to say is, what, these changes are happening. They're also affecting your short term and making things, supply maybe more elastic. Maybe prices don't need to move as much as they needed to before to clear the market. It'll look like sticky prices, but we argue it's not sticky prices. In fact, it's the opposite. So we hope that but these things take time, but we hope others will follow. Maybe some of them in the audience will look more into detail into these issues. We ourselves have a research program now, which looking at different aspects of this, including on the inequality aspect of it, including on the financing and how do you finance it, because you can't use a traditional lending model. Traditional lending means the banker knew what industry, say textiles you're in, make you a loan, and then they can, and now here nobody knows what the outcome will be. So how do you finance in a way, what looks very speculative? But once it works, it's brilliant. But if it doesn't work, so you need a more risk-based approach to lending, which is different from bank-based lending, different from securities markets. It's a very different approach. So we're looking into those things. Now, in terms of the business schools and the future of the job market, that is indeed, there I feel in many ways that the business profession and the business schools are much further along already in recognizing these changes. And based on, in fact, I have been to some of those training programs, which are done executive education. And they are very much at the cutting edge of recognizing that these are the changes that are needed in terms of executive leadership. For instance, what this changes mean is that, pockets of expertise might develop in a company, which of course the CEO will never have. But the point of the CEO is not to be the expert at everything. The point of the CEO is to be able to identify the people who can develop the brand or the expertise for that company and create a market-leading product or process that everybody can use. So it's changing the nature of management. There, I believe it's already happening because, because the examples from actual corporations and the marketplace come in, and it is very quickly fed into business education. So I'm actually thinking that in terms of what the future leadership model will do is already being in many ways taught. What we are trying to do here is provide a structure for that, a framework, and especially spanning economics with the business school, because we are economists, some of us, and so we do need some kind of a framework through which to look. When we go out on a walk, I look at a building and I'm trying to think, okay, in my model, how does this fit in? And then I look at it and I realize, okay, probably this building was designed on a computer first. It was completely simulated to see how it affects, how it is affected by the sunlight and the winds before they actually even put the first brick in place. So you see it everywhere once you start noticing it. Thank you.
Thank you. I have a bit of technical questions, the nerd inside of me that wants to bring them up. And I've seen some of the audiences are also nerdy and asking technical questions. So how were you able to measure intangible investment in developing countries? Can you give us more concrete examples of what are the things that you've included? Because I've seen the data spans all the way back to 1990.
Yes.
There was a question actually about people who have spotted out that the UK, Belgium, and Denmark have a downward sloping supply curve. Can you explain how does this happen? And I think the other, I'll leave the rest for the third batch. So,
okay, no, very good questions. Now, on measuring intangible investment, it is it's actually very challenging because not all of it is included in GDP, for example. So, Corrado Hulton and Corrado and her colleagues, they have spent years and years, and there's a big project also in Europe to try to capture more of that in the national accounts as well. So it's statistically onerous because how do you? I mentioned, for example, one of the problems with intangible investment is it's often not something that it's highly specific and cannot be sold in a secondary market. So what value do you assign to it, for example? But there is a very serious effort underway to expand that to more and more countries. And we were grateful to be able to use the data that they have collected and cleaned up. But and in fact, there are a number of papers written on the challenges of, it's like, in accounting, which is a different segment, I guess, of business schools, how do you, there are books written, in fact, on intangible investment and how do you value it? Because the big issue is, for example, in many cases, in accounting, intangible investment is treated as a cost. As an expense, whereas if you treat it for what it truly is, maybe you should look at it differently. And so, and I'll be happy to provide a reference in a couple of fascinating articles, books, in fact, written on this issue of intangible investment. Just to give you an example, just to maybe whet the appetites of the audience, you know, when we look at some of these companies that are world leaders now, for a long period of time, they showed no profits at all, you know, and yet the stock market valuations seemed high, and everybody thought this must be a bubble. I look at PE ratios. Who has PE ratios of 100 or something, you know, when the market average is 15? This doesn't make any sense. So you could argue it's a bubble. On the other hand, if you're looking at these companies and thinking, what are they, and this might be of interest to some of your business, in the audience, our business school colleagues, what these companies are basically doing is investing heavily in their intangible capital. So they're not showing profits because they're plowing it all back. And, you know, the stock market wants its quarterly returns, right? But instead, they're spending everything they've got and more in building their intangible investment. Why is that important? And so maybe the market is in fact getting it right. They're looking at what these companies are spending their free cash flow on. And maybe that's, and why that's important. Remember, we talked about scalability, which means that the more you produce, the better your return. So your marginal costs go down, say in an extreme example. What that means is if you're the company that has invested heavily, you have a cost advantage over your competitors. So in the future, maybe your market share will be bigger because you can produce things more cheaply, the marginal cost is lower, and you can share that with your consumers. And maybe that's why the stock market is already rewarding them, because they're saying, you know what, these guys are spending on trying to basically improve their cost structure, because then once they've got it, they can replicate it much more cheaply. Whereas those companies that have a legacy business in another sector, for instance, they will still have the cost of that legacy business and the new business, and they may not be as competitive. I'm just thinking out loud here, but that might be one of the reasons why it is some of the issues that come up when you start thinking more about intangible investment and the stock market, for instance, or valuations. There was a question so it's not just about what is reported, but in fact also what is valued. And maybe the markets value them properly, but we cannot figure out why, because there's an unexplained part, because we're not seeing that in quarterly profits yet. And there are companies, you know, and I don't need to name them, where you can see that, you know, they made losses for 10 years and people thought, what's going on? And now you realize, wow, these are some of the biggest companies in the world. Now, there is data, yes. I mean, I wouldn't, you know, those specific issues mentioned for a number of countries. We were also a little puzzled by some of the, you know, it depends on how the data is constructed, and we haven't really gone into country-specific details. So that's why we rely more on using the cross-country evidence in support of our conclusions, rather than what individual countries might show. It's a good question, but I think that would require a deeper dive into individual country developments. Back to you, Dr.
Yeah, thank you. So a lot of the audience are interested in the book, so I'm going to repeat their names. It's Capitalism Without Capital by Haskell, and Hit the Refresh Button by Nadella. Yes. So you've alluded to that. A concern and a question among the audience, and I share their concern, is that you said that this type of intangible is that you invest in the beginning and then you basically milk it later on, or reap the benefits from it later on. And it seems to me that this is a replica of previous industrial revolutions, where there are a minority that has a technology that enabled them to grow their wealth faster, and it seems that there is some sort of concentration of wealth, and yeah, at least to the concern that is shared a lot yes, in the public sphere about inequality. So, yes, and this sort of monopoly yes, is without naming companies, they became the the target of many attacks on their power in the market. So can you address this issue, please?
Yes, this is a very good question. And both actually, there are two parts to it. So let's unpack it a little bit. One is on the concentration of wealth and inequality. I mean, that is clearly an issue. And there one needs to think about things like what can fiscal policy do, a more, taxation systems, redistribution, for instance, because clearly what you don't want is that the few people who've created intangible capital, earn amounts of wealth that they or their families will never be able to spend even in 10 generations, and everybody else gets nothing. So that's a fiscal policy issue, the way I look at it, and taxation. And that's something that public policy has to deal with. Now, the question, though, on is it the same as the previous industrial revolutions? There, I would offer a different view. And I will give an example also without naming companies. And the reason for that is the way, what looks like a monopoly may be happening is how they build a moat around the competition is by having a better cost structure. That's what I mean, right? I mean, the example I gave earlier. So you invest a lot in it, you're scaling up. Your monopoly power only comes from the fact that you're offering the goods and services cheaper. I mean, this is an exaggeration, but to a large extent, it can be because of that in theory, which means that you have not built a wall around your industry or sector. You have to keep innovating to maintain that advantage. And the example I was going to use without naming names is we used to have a kind of smartphone, if you remember 15 years ago, which everybody used and which had a nice keyboard on it. And we thought that was the future. And guess what? It's gone because someone else came along with a different smartphone, which doesn't have that keyboard, and which, you might think, okay, that was a loss, but no, but it does a lot of things and does a lot of things better. So there's no natural, it's not like a utility, like electricity company. There's no barriers to entry. So, which means we think, Lee and I, that, this is, you need to constantly keep reinventing yourself. It's not like traditional industries with physical capital where you create barriers to entry. Here with non-physical investment, intangible investment, that's the beauty, that your market power remains only to the extent that you're offering a product or services at a better price, but under fair rules of the game. That's a different issue, and I'm not an expert in that, but just there's a little bit of distinction from past industrial revolutions. But hopefully the smartphone example is a way to illustrate that. But keep in mind, but the inequality issue, absolutely, and we need to, and in fact, we are doing another project looking at that. What does it mean for inequality, for example, even within skilled workers, right? Those who have the skills might get high rewards within a company, even as employees, but those who can be substituted away might get nothing. So how do you take care of that? That's a public policy issue. It's a very serious issue, and I would say one of the most serious issues all of us will be confronting over the next decade or so.
I have a couple of quick yes or no questions, and then I have a bigger question. First of all, one of the yes or no questions, what about the barriers to entry to the current high-tech firms? Would you still consider that they have in this sphere there are no barriers to entry?
I mean, some barriers do arise. I think I mean, that's clear, right? I mean, but it's not as straightforward and black and white as sometimes it's made out to be. That's what I would say. I mean, of course, there can be natural barriers to entry, for example, because a company gets bigger, it has a bigger stock market valuation, it has access to financial resources, it can do a lot of things that new entrants may not be able to do, because the high valuation itself becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy in a way, and one needs to have the appropriate environment for that to be able to,
Another quick answer question. I think somebody who is looking to invest. Do you think there is still future in digital apps being some sort of future intangible capital, or we've reached a degree of saturation?
Okay, so first I should say I'm not comfortable giving investment advice. I should also mention on the regulatory side that we talked about on monopolies and market. But again, I'm not an expert in that, so I'm just giving my own personal views on how I see it in the framework we presented. But is there a future in apps? I mean, look, my apps are one aspect of it. My view is we are still at the beginning of the process, and the future is limitless. So, if I were to venture, I think that we have only tapped the surface of the possibilities. Not necessarily just apps, but it's hard to visualize. There might be other ways of, utilizing it. So. Yeah, no, I mean, we are far from saturation in anything. I mean, I think the opportunities are there. It's just that, again, it needs imagination and creativity to think about it, but, it's all there. Yeah, thanks.
Very good. The two long-term questions, and I'm going to leave it in the end. The first one has to do looking into the future out of this crisis. You mentioned that this intangible investment gives ability for economies to go back up quickly. Do you think that the pandemic shock we can get quickly up from it in the V-shaped recovery? This is the first question. The second question, you seem to emphasize a lot on skills. And there were a couple of questions about the education, especially in developing countries. Can you address the issue of how developing countries should look for opportunities in education and investment in skills moving forward?
Yes, sure. I mean, as far as the pandemic and recovery goes, it's a little outside the scope of what we're discussing today, especially because what we're talking about is more of a, in a steady state when the economy has a regular recession and when intangible investments will be a very large part of the economy, which is true in some cases, but it's really only catching up. So I think the framework we present today might not be fully applicable to the current scenario for most countries, because this is sort of more looking ahead, how things are transforming. So, the recoveries here now will depend on individual countries from the current big shock, which everybody faced, and the policy measures taken. So that will vary, and it's sort of outside the scope of the work we are doing, which is more, I mean, if you ask me the same question 20 years from now, I would be able to give a more precise answer because I would know more about where different countries are in this process that we have tried to outline. On emphasizing skills, education, I mean, clearly, investment in education is important. Education is an important public good, and all countries, the more they invest in education, the better it is for future generations. But it's not just about how much money goes into education, but what is the type of education that is provided with that same amount of money. And what we argue here, based on our framework, is that what we see is that the kinds of skills that would be rewarded in the marketplace are the ones that can take advantage of these ongoing changes. And that's why I mentioned, creativity, problem-solving skills, the ability to work together, and there's a component of that being, sort of collaborative working relationships between people to come together and create, say, a product or a service. Those are the kinds of things, soft skills, those will become more and more important. And I was drawing a distinction between, sometimes the old education system decades ago used to be in many countries, at least a lot about, how well you do an exam, and the way you aced an exam was often that you had also good, enormous capacity to remember things. And now maybe that's less important because you have basically access to all of the world's knowledge at your fingertips. The question is, what do you do with that knowledge and how do you utilize it? Not because a smartphone will probably hold more quote unquote knowledge than you can ever hold in your brain, because that's computing power. And yeah. I mentioned one of the facets was unlimited access, more or less unlimited access to storage is one of those things. So the question is, what do you do with it?
Very true. I think we've reached our time. Again, on behalf of our attendees, on behalf of people on social media attending the webinar, Dr. Subir, I want to thank you so much for your time and for your very generous insights on what the future holds for us, whether we are in this part of the world or in more advanced economies. It's truly very inspiring to think about what the future holds to us, and very interesting to think about how different things will be. Thank you so much again. Thank you for your time and your insight. Thank you so much for all the attendees. I just want to point out that the slides and the recording of the webinar will be on our webpage and on all our social media platforms. Thank you so much and have a nice evening.
Thank you, Dr. Subir. Thank you for the audience as well, and everybody for, I hope this was of interest. Just to make sure that, on the first page of the presentation, this was based on some work that I'm doing with my colleagues. So please, these are my personal views and should not be attributed to the IMF, its executive board, or its management. It's a disclaimer I had to,
I know, of course.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.